Sabrina 2000s comic, issue 37. Zelda asks Sabrina what she's doing in the attic. Why did she bother going in the attic anyways? Who goes in the attic? Sabrina says she's just poking around, trying on old clothes. That is kind of a nice hat. She figures out that Sabrina's been thinking about Halloween, and Sabrina wants to go as someone unusual this year and do something different. Why should I care? Zelda says she's sure to find something unusual with all this ancient junk up here. Too bad she didn't think to sell the stuff she doesn't like anymore, or zap it away. Sabrina says she's looking through these older books for ideas too. Zelda said ancient junk because this is a house for witches who've lived for hundreds of years. So you'd think she'd immediately realize that there's a chance that Sabrina could find something witch-related in the attic that would cause problems, because the ancient stuff would be there because witches had it. So it's more likely to be magical. But instead she sneezes and decides to leave because it's too dusty up here for her. And she's a drooling idiot, so she doesn't immediately think to just cast a spell to get rid of all the dust in here. And she doesn't even talk as if she's planning to return here with a feather duster. Which you'd think she'd do, because since Sabrina's in the attic, now is the perfect time to make it less dusty for her. Instead, the supposedly responsible aunt not only didn't feel like having all of the rooms in her house be clean and let one get dusty, but she recklessly leaves Sabrina alone in a witch's attic and just tells her to remember to turn the light off. You'd think if the entire premise of the animated series is that Sabrina's aunts are really strict about the most good possible behavior, she'd be more responsible than this. I don't even know what she's planning to do instead of stay here. Predictably, Sabrina finds something witch-related in the attic. You know, since she's not allowed to use magic sometimes, you'd think her aunt would have gotten into the habit of locking away all of the magical artifacts in one room specifically designated for them, which I thought was the case in the first story. She reads a magic book and says it's very enchanting, which seems like stilted dialogue. She goes to show them her costume and the witches scream. Oh, good. It's because she's dressed like Enchantra, so no wonder some omnipotent witches screamed. I can't help but love seeing the Enchantra costume, even if it just makes me wish I was reading the 90s comic instead. Zelda says Enchantra and Hilda tells her to hush, and somehow, despite the fact that Hilda said this all panicked, somehow Sabrina is dumb enough to continue being cheerful and try to say Enchantra again. So Zelda uses magic to send a cup into her mouth. Hilda says that's too, and she warns Sabrina not to say that name again. If she had a brain, she'd simply cast a spell on her so that she couldn't say that name again for a while. If she was really smart, she'd cast a spell so that nobody in the house could say that name. Zelda warns Sabrina about who she's impersonating. The most powerful sorceress in this or any other universe, who can travel backwards and forwards in time, bothering anyone she thinks is sister, including anyone who says her name 3 times in 1 hour, which is somehow considered a diss to force the plot. Any witch can travel forwards and backwards in time. And you know, you could have kept it simple and explained that of course she has a spell that if witches say her name 3 times, she'll start hearing them, because clearly she's being talked about in a conversation. And she's so spiteful that she wants any excuse she can to punish anyone. Every witch has been omnipotent since the start of the series. It's so ironic that Enchantra is way more of a menacing head witch than Della is. When Della forced the witches to abuse magic and punish them for doing good deeds. So you'd think that in a comic where Sabrina's aunts are pressuring her to be good, the head witch would be really good. It's a pleasant surprise that she looks just like Enchantra from the 90s comic. I was wondering if she'd ever show up in this comic. If she does show up, it's going to be so obviously telegraphed. Sabrina says she had no idea, and she just saw Enchantra's picture in one of those old books, and thought she had a cool outfit and hairdo. Why would she say hairdo as well when I thought it looked ridiculous immediately? This could have easily been avoided if her witch aunts had the common sense to tell Hilda about the head witch as early as possible, instead of yet another plot being caused by her aunts being irresponsible, with no self-awareness about it. You'd think they would have told her about Enchantra literally on the day that they would be telling her that witches are real, because it'd be a necessary part of establishing the witch world to her. Not to mention it'd prevent her from making this mistake. At least Zelda is forgiving enough to say, that's alright. And Hilda foolishly says they'll discuss it more after you change, without simply using magic to make her change right away. She looks so much like Enchantra here that I kept wanting to call her that. Sabrina says she doesn't know how people walk around in heels anyways. which is a contrast to the 70s Sabrina who is happy with walking around in platform shoes. And then Salem shows up and says that Sabrina looks like Enchantra because he just has to state the obvious, with nothing to gain from it. When you'd think that as a witch himself, he'd know better than to say her name. I could understand if Enchantra showed up because she was actually being insulted. Sabrina could have insulted her hairdo. But instead they have the most forced excuse ever to bring her into the comic. Salem even says that Enchantra was required reading at the Druid Academy. Since it's said that the spirit shield around their house won't stop Enchantra, and in fact it could tip her off to their presence, Sabrina says to take it down. If she's the head witch, she would already know where they live. Salem would know that. Zelda says a forced line, and it turns out they were all trapped in a gem by Enchantra, but Salem used his power to put them all inside the same facet. As usual, I'd much rather one of the other witches use their powers, instead of a guy who shouldn't still have his powers. But at least he was helpful. Hilda calls Sabrina a sweetheart, and Enchantra somehow finds it offensive that they're all together. Salem makes a call, and Enchantra gets sent away by Spooky, because he's in charge of protecting the Spellmans. He is? But they're witches, they should be able to protect themselves! No wonder I never knew why this was why he was in the house with them. This is like one of the only times he's ever protected them. And why did they have his utmost affection? And wouldn't he be too scared to bother the head witch? Despite Salem saying to Spooky to spring them and not fight Enchantra alone, and despite Hilda saying that they could combine their powers, somehow he just tells Enchantra to release them when it's immediately obvious that she won't do what she's told. She zaps him and knocks him out, wasting a ton of panels on repetition. He looks burned at least, but I have no reason to believe he won't be uninjured in the next story. He smashes the diamond and frees them just by hitting it with his fist, and uses his last bit of energy to teleport them to the basement, because they store their old flying broomsticks here in their book of spells, so they could get to a safe hiding place and find a way to deal with Enchantra. What place would be safe to hide in? Salem goes to see if the coast is clear, as I'm wondering why Enchantra doesn't immediately use the spell to locate them, like send a crystal ball to her. They would be assuming she'd do that. They manually climb out of the basement into their yard, and Zelda says to hook around the garage and head due west. Then they get told to stay there, even though the secretary shows up. She does look a little different because she has red in her hair. She's even an old friend of Salem's, and she recognizes his voice. She hits him for standing her up for the senior prom at secretary school. Was it really too simple to just have her hit Salem because he tried to take over the world? Instead, he's punished for something we just learned about. That's the usual reaction from one of his ex-girlfriends. At least she's badass here. She says Sabrina has an appointment and her aunts can't see Sabrina anymore. If only. They're being good in this story, but just you wait. Salem feels sorry for Sabrina, and Sabrina says what is your problem because she's always an idiot. You'd think she'd be polite. She tells her to get over herself when she should be grateful that Enchantra appreciated being called lady. She turns Sabrina into a fly, and Sabrina sarcastically says that solves everything. I expect her to just be scared, but at least this way she looks brave and is standing up for herself. Shockingly, Enchantra turns her back to normal and says that she needs her around and decides to explain what's been going on. But she doesn't need to turn her back to normal right now. She already knows that Sabrina is familiar with Rotunda the Troll from Juvie. She explains that several years from now, Rotunda will mutate into a goblin and change her name into Repulsa. And we see her break a golf club, and she says that she'll constantly challenge Enchantra on the golf course. It's definitely a twist, because she looks nothing like her. Apparently, trolls always mutate into goblins in this comic. It's just their aging process, along with them aging fast. They're magical creatures, so this can make sense. Enchantra warns Sabrina that Repulsa sent Sabrina back to relive her teenage years at the end of the 90s comic. I can't believe this comic actually referenced that again. I have a question. What took so long? Enchantra finds it very distracting as a cosmic executive. Then she would have come here earlier. She says Sabrina will grow up sooner than she thinks. Sabrina is confused and is told to handle it because Enchantra is very busy, and somehow only Sabrina can break this cyclical spell. But Enchantra's the most powerful witch. I wish I was told what she had to do now that was more important. She is head witch, so I can't believe that she does have important administrative duties to do right now. Sabrina gets sent to a place that stinks and is scary, as I wonder why she's being trusted with this task as an incompetent apprentice witch without her aunts to ensure victory. She gets grabbed by Repulsa's right-hand man, who is told to throw Sabrina in the sulfur pit. Somehow Sabrina didn't zap him in all the time he was talking. At least she does so in the third panel. It's cathartic to see animated series Sabrina say, "I am sick and tired of being pushed and pulled and told what to do." I bet she's been wanting to say that to her aunts for a long time. She sends him into the pit. Wouldn't falling into sulfur be lethal? So she killed him. But he is evil. Then Repulsa talks to her, and Sabrina wastes time talking to her and letting her talk when she's in danger and should really just zap her instantly. She says she's gonna mess with Sabrina's age again. Once again, a very petty and random thing to do. Only this time, she's gonna keep Quigley for herself, because she thinks he's kinda cute. He wouldn't be by goblin standards. If only she kept him for herself in the issues before this. She would have had a better life. Sabrina wastes time telling off a cartoon villain, as if that'll do anything. She threatens to make Salem a cockroach this time around. Finally, Sabrina hits her with everything she's got. And suddenly Repulsa acts scared of her unrealized power, even though it's unrealized. And says she'll cancel her time loop spell. Is she just pretending to be defeated so easily? That'd be an easy excuse to pad out the story. Enchantress says that's definitely Sabrina's individual energy signature. And she was worried that Repulsa had slipped a fake you into this time stream. An odd thing to worry about. She says this exam is over, and brings Sabrina back to the beginning of this adventure. I thought she was going to visit Sabrina because her name was said 3 times. Why did that rule suddenly change? The witches would have known if it did. It just seems like the writer forgot. Then Sabrina gets sent back to several hours ago and shows Zelda a different Halloween costume, which Zelda condescendingly calls cute even though Sabrina isn't that young. Hilda thinks she'll get a lot of candy, and Salem and Enchantra unnecessarily break the 4th wall. In the next story, Salem tells the audience a strange tale again. Are these canon? He was out walking on Halloween night during a terrible thunderstorm that didn't bother him because he's got powers. So he doesn't care that he almost got hit by lightning. I suppose part of the spell he had on him is not being able to hear lightning. Suddenly, he hears animal sounds coming from a basement window, and saw a mad scientist near a giant robot cat. At least this is more interesting than mundane, typical stories of the comic. Somehow, the scientist couldn't get RoboCat to sound like a cat, even though he knows enough about science to make a giant robot cat. I wish he looked like Professor Transistor from the Archie's Madhouse stories, because he's got the same personality by being impossibly incompetent. He even has white hair and a lab coat. He's so generic, there's no reason for him not to be named after Transistor. He wishes he could have a real cat so that he could add his voice to his robot. Couldn't he just Google what a cat sounds like? Then all of a sudden the writing changes the rules and has lightning striking near Salem startle him and cause him to fall towards a window, when just 2 pages ago he didn't care about lightning. I have to assume the spell on him wore off with time. But why? And he falls through the window ridiculously easily. And somehow he didn't have any shards of glass stuck in him when realistically he'd be bleeding. The fall did knock him out though. The story makes no sense. After the professor thought to keep the cat stuck to a chair by chewing a pack of gum, he decided to waste time telling what he thinks is a mere cat about his entire evil plan, which he calls an evil plan himself, unrealistically. He wouldn't have the patience for this. And neither would Salem. Salem would just immediately point at him and use magic on him, not listen to his boring story when he's mad at him. But apparently he was just that curious. The professor explains that when he was older, he wasn't allowed to go trick-or-treating anymore, because someone wanted to call the cops on him for being a weirdo. He wants revenge for this, so he created a giant mecha to sit in as the ultimate Halloween costume so that no one will refuse him candy ever again. At least it's a creative backstory. He must have already had anger issues if something this petty drove him to this. Salem must just be messing with him when he talks in front of him, because it's obvious that the professor wanted to hear him meow. He says this is a Halloween trick, and then he tells his giant RoboCat to attack, instead of trying to find out why the cat can talk. Maybe he thinks he'll only get him to tell him the truth after he has him trapped in the paw of that robot. Salem has enough time to turn the robot into a giant, harmless pussycat. It's still giant. Enough that it's trapped in the room it's in. Salem tells the audience he left out the really scary part. And it cuts to the cat somehow sleeping on his bed as he asks, "How do I get rid of this thing?" That is funny enough to be charming, but pretty soon I wondered why I didn't simply cast a spell to get rid of this thing a long time ago. It was impressively merciful of a guy who wanted to take over the world that he merely did this to it instead of destroying a robot. Like I'd expect. I like that he did that. The first story had Sabrina get told she made a mistake because she dressed up like Enchantra after seeing her photo in a book in the attic. Which she wouldn't have thought to do if Zelda had the sense to keep supervising her when she was looking for Halloween costume ideas in Witch's Attic. Instead, Zelda left, instead of instantly getting rid of all the dust she hated so much. And you'd think her aunts would have told her about Enchantra the first day that they'd tell her about witches. She shows up angry just because her name was said 3 times. And traps Sabrina's family in a gem. Why did she take offense to her name being said a bunch, and not to her being impersonated for a Halloween costume? Maybe that is why she got mad, but then she would have said so. But somehow, after Sabrina was surprisingly rude to her when she was already in trouble with a powerful head witch for the first time, when I'd expect her to just be terrified, somehow her insolence about being turned into a fly immediately convinces her to change her back to normal, rather than her being changed into a monster who would better intimidate Repulsa and her assistant, when she wanted to send her to fight them with her magic in the first place. I can easily believe Enchantra has more important stuff to do as the head witch, but still, you'd think the most powerful witch would be more suited to the task of fighting Queen Repulsa with magic. I was wondering why Sabrina didn't instantly use her magic on his assistant and her instead of letting them talk first. But thankfully logic kicked in and she did instantly defeat them both with her magic. And Enchantra didn't want to be disappointed and said that her exam was over, so she sent Sabrina to do it to test her abilities. It's not like she even did anything interesting. It's underwhelming that we only saw one panel of her bothering both of them. They deserved a lot more cartoon slapstick than that. I want to see Repulsa get bounced around like an AOSDH character, not turn blue and tell Sabrina not to hurt her. But I was proud of Sabrina, but more needed to happen for such an epic concept. This was a long time coming. You'd think this would have happened in the first issue, logically. Why did Enchantra take so long? The second story, by Angelo de Cesare, was more enjoyable, but still made no sense. And since the story told by Salem, well, good thing it turns out to be true in the end, so it's not pointless. But at first I think it is. It makes no sense that right after we got told that as a warlock, thunder and lightning don't bother Salem, a lightning bolt sends him falling through a window way too easily. Somehow not dead from all the shards of glass falling into him and merely knocked out instead. He falls into a mad scientist's lab, and sadly he's not called Professor Transistor. Does he even have a name? It's lazy if he doesn't. His goal is creative. He wants to get candy for Halloween from inside of a mecha. But since Salem's a witch, he just uses magic to make the mecha nice and fluffy. And somehow he doesn't think to make it the same size as him too. So it ends the story sleeping on a bed and still bothering him. Even though he's omnipotent.